Alrighty, welcome to Enhanced Preps Reading Comprehension Super Review. Thank you so much for joining. Today we're going to cover all the key strategies for the reading sections on both the SAT and ACT. So no matter which test you take, we got you covered. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. You can either unmute yourselves or send something into the chat. Now, I'm curious, how many of you have already taken either the SAT or ACT? You can either raise your hand, there's that function there, or drop something into the chat. Alrighty, I see we have one person has taken one of them. Okay, nice. Alrighty. So let's go over what you're going to expect on both of these exams. So if you're going to take that test again, or maybe you have switched routes, we got you covered with key strategies. Before we do that, just want to give you a little bit of a background on myself. So I earned my bachelor's degree in English literature and language from NYU, and then I earned my master's degree in teaching English at Columbia University's Teachers College. I also have some classroom experience in New York City as a reading interventionist. So this is my expertise, it's my specialty, and I love to make it a lot simpler for students because I know it seems a lot more complicated than it is. And both the SAT and ACT kind of do that on purpose. So I'm going to show you some tricks along the way while I make fun of the people who make these tests. Okay, so something I want to also cover with you all. Test optional versus test blind. Those are two very different things. So if your school that you're interested in says test blind, that means you could send them a perfect score. They will not look at it. Although some schools have claimed they're test blind, and it turns out that they actually were still using test scores for admissions. Now, even if that school is test blind, keep in mind, they still use SAT and ACT scores for scholarships. So either way, it's useful. Versus if something is test optional, what that really means is that it is test recommended, because let's say someone else applies to that school and they have a very similar transcript, very similar extracurricular activities, leadership positions, but that person sends in a competitive SAT or ACT score. The school is going to go with that person. So whenever they say test optional, it's really test recommended. And honestly, that's the advice for most things in life. If it says optional, they're just testing to see who's willing to put in the effort. Like if you apply for a job and it says cover letter optional, best believe that the recruiter is going to give priority to the people who took the time to write that cover letter. So same thing here, it's best to actually still go ahead and try it, submit it, because with both of these tests, it's all about practice. Like these tests don't measure your worth, your intelligence, none of that. It's all about how well and how often, how consistently you practiced. Okay, so here's the agenda for today. We're going to talk about how much the reading sections weigh on the SAT versus ACT. We'll talk about strategy for both exams, and then we'll get into the most commonly tested question types, looking at words in context, when they ask you about a specific line, when they ask you about the author's purpose, main idea, when you're analyzing characters, and then when you're also doing those dual passages. And we'll also include other helpful elimination tips. So hopefully after today's workshop, I'll take some of that stress away from you if you're feeling any of it towards the reading sections. And just the fact that you're here also says a lot, because many students are not putting in not many, but there are some students who aren't really putting in that same effort. So the fact that you're here already says a lot. So thank you again for joining. Okay. Now let's talk about its importance on the SAT. So as you may have already experienced, the SAT went from paper to digital this year. So now instead of a separate reading section and a separate writing section, they combine them together. So what you get is something called modules. You'll get a module, which is kind of like its own section in a sense. In the first module, that's going to have 27 reading and writing questions that you answer in 32 minutes. Depending on your accuracy in module 1, then you move on to module 2. So if your accuracy was high, then you will get a harder difficulty level module 2. But if your accuracy was lower, then you'll get the easy module. The goal is to typically aim towards the hard module because then you have more of a chance to earn more points. So again, those two modules, each of them are 32 minutes, 27 questions. The only difference between them is difficulty levels, whereas one is a combination of easier, medium, harder difficulty. Module 2 depends on how you do for module 1. Now, I mentioned before that reading and writing are combined in the same module, but it's not like random, like reading, then writing, reading, then writing. In the first half of each module, you're going to see reading questions only reading. So this could be from question 1 anywhere to 17. It might stop at 13, anywhere between 13 to 17. Then in the second half of each module, then you get your writing questions. And these typically can start anywhere from 14 to 18 and goes all the way through 27. And I'll show you exactly how to differentiate between the two because they look dramatically different. Now, your strategy here should be to focus on just one section at a time, meaning we don't want to do a reading question and then skip to writing and back to reading, back and forth like that. It's going to be a recipe for disaster if you do that. Instead, prioritize the questions that feel easier for you. So for some students, they hate punctuation. They don't want to start with writing questions. They don't want to go to question 14 and start there. They're going to start with reading. I have some students who can't stand the reading. They actually like that the writing takes less time and effort. So they'll start with the writing, and the vast majority of students should start with writing. But if those writing questions feel like more of a pain for you, don't start there, right? You want to start with an easier lift, just like if you're working out. You're not going to hit the weights that are higher. You're going to hit the weights lower, warm yourself up, and then you can lift heavier. Now, here is the average emphasis of content tested by question type, meaning this is how many questions of each type that we see per module for module 1. So words in context, look at how many there are there compared to everything else, right? That is significant compared to everything else. They like to test these the most, which is a good thing because the words in context reading questions tend to take less time. You only have to zoom into typically a few sentences, and you're not looking at like the whole paragraph. You're looking at just a few context clues. If you're a little bit nervous about vocab, there are ways that you can also improve that, but I would say the number one thing is practice so that you can see which words throw you off. Anytime you see a new word or an unfamiliar word, look up the definition, but also look up root words because root words, and you can just go ahead and Google, like, let's say copious came up on the last SAT exam. So you would look up copious root word because if you know root words, that is the best way to build up your vocabulary. Now, these other questions, the ones that come up more often would be main idea. We see that coming up over here at about 1.5, 1.5 questions per module 1. And then we have these charts and graphs. So a little bit of like quantitative analysis, text completion. Those are the question types that are coming up more, author's purpose. So what I have highlighted in yellow actually takes a bit more time than the words in context. So we're going to go over how to navigate those questions to make sure that we're always doing the ones that take less time and effort first. Now, let's talk about the ACT in terms of how important it is to talk about how important the reading is for the overall score. Now, the reading is the third section, so that's also something very important to keep in mind. By the time you hit the reading on the ACT, you will have already completed 75 English questions in the first section. Then you have 60 math questions in the second section. And then you have 40 questions to answer in 35 minutes in the third section. They show up as 10 questions in a passage, 4 passages total. These are typically the passage types. So literary narrative, by the way, that's just like fiction. That's probably typically what you're reading in school for the most part in terms of your English class. Then social sciences, humanities, so a little bit more of like typically, sometimes they'll talk about psychology, sometimes they'll bring up economics, history, things like that. And then they also have a natural science passage From my experience, that tends to be more detail oriented. So if you like more of the scientific reading, I would say that one is the one you may want to start with first. That one may be a little bit of a lighter lift for you, especially because they don't ask as many big picture questions, which could take a little bit more time and effort. Now, in terms of the reading section's importance on the ACT, it makes up 25% of the composite score, right? Whereas over here, something to keep in mind, yes, the reading section, there's only one of it. Like it actually says reading, but science, that section is also technically reading. You don't have to actually know science for the science section. They don't test your knowledge on that. There's literally maybe 2 or 3 questions in the science section that asks for your outside knowledge. For the most part, the science is just another reading section with a science theme that's more about reading charts and reading a little bit of text. So technically, if you think about it, because science is also reading comprehension based, this is more like 50% of the score in terms of reading comp. Okay, I just threw a lot of information your way. Please feel free to either drop something in the chat or unmute yourself and ask me any questions at all. All right, let's keep going. So let's talk about the question types on average. How many of them come up for a reading section on the ACT? If you take a look here, the ones that come up the most are detail, unlike the SAT. And this is actually a good thing though, because detail tends to take less time than, let's say, author's purpose that asks about the whole passage, or even main idea that again needs to, requires a bit of deeper thought about a whole paragraph or even the whole passage. In terms of words in context, roughly about the same amount as on the SAT. And we also really like words in context because, again, as I mentioned before, it's going to take a little bit less time. Now, let's talk about the 2 different strategies. In a sense, they do something very similar. Your first step will always be to preview, take a look at a question or take a look at a passage in terms of the ACT, and prioritize it in terms of, oh, should I answer this question first? Is this going to be a lighter lift for me? On the ACT, you're asking yourself, should I read this passage first? Is this passage going to cause me the least amount of pain? Then for the second step here, it's focused on questions. We always have to look at the questions before we actually look at the text. Otherwise, we're not going to be very focused. We're not going to be very strategic as we're reading, and we're going to just have to keep rereading. So on the SAT, we have to look at the question and work it. What we mean by that is to annotate, underline, highlight. For the SAT, you can use the highlighter tool. So that's going to be to your advantage. On the ACT, because that's paper, you're circling, you're underlining, you're putting stars next to it. And what you're doing is you're figuring out which questions you're going to answer first there as well. Now, step 3, after we figured out which question we want to tackle on the SAT, after we figure out which passage we want to tackle and which questions we want to tackle first on the ACT, now it's time to read the passage, but you want to resist the urge to just kind of speed through it. You are going to be more likely to zone out. We don't want that to happen because if that happens, we're letting the test makers win, and we're not trying to do that, right? So actively working the passage, keyword here, actively, you have to really make sure that you are underlining, circling, highlighting in terms of digital SAT. And we're going to go over specific things that you should be annotating, underlining, highlighting as you read. By keeping your pencil or the cursor active that way, you're less likely to zone out. And we don't want you to have to reread this a whole bunch of stuff. These are pretty boring passages, right? Reading it once is already it's enough. So we want to prevent you wasting time, wasting your energy, because it's very, very precious. Now, step number 4, I cannot emphasize this one enough. And this is the one that students somewhat struggle with because it's not what you're used to doing in school. In school, you're probably used to reading a question, going straight to the answer choices, right? Don't do that here. That's how they're going to guide your thoughts towards a trap. What's really, really important here is that you ignore those answers, ignore them. You have to think for yourself based on the textual evidence. Make sure you understand where the textual evidence is, summarize it. Then you can do your process of elimination. And when I say process of elimination, another way I want you to think of it is to take out the trash. Look for what's wrong and get rid of it. When you're looking for what's wrong, it's so much easier to spot it. But if you're looking for what's right, you may try to make the trap answer right. You may see that there's a trap answer that's half right, and then it's going to throw you off. You're going to get stuck between two. We want to avoid that. All right, so let's jump into step number 1. On the SAT, you're previewing questions and prioritizing which ones are worth your time first. On the ACT, you're previewing and prioritizing which passages you want to tackle first, second, third, and then last. So let's jump into it to see what that looks like. So on the SAT, you want to figure out where the reading section ends and begins, because remember, there's that range. It may end at 14, it may end at 16. So here is one way of knowing. The writing questions, let me just write this over here really quickly. So let me just make sure that's nice and big for you all to see. So writing questions, they always mention the conventions of standard English. And usually you'll see punctuation, you may see verbs. It'll feel very different. The second you see that they mention something like called conventions, or if they say standard English, that's how you know the writing section has begun. And they always start the writing section the same way with those conventions of standard English, which is just punctuation rules, grammar, things like that. All right, let me actually just drop this down here. Whereas if you take a look at this question, which choice best states the main idea of the text? Well, that's definitely a reading question because they're testing if we understood the heart, the essence of this paragraph. So depending on your goal score too, let's say if you're aiming for 1200 or below, you may not have to complete every main idea question. You may not want to start there. What I also recommend is to never leave anything blank. If you don't have time for something, or if a question is not worth your time, please put something down and stick to one letter only. That's really, really important. So I'll go over why and how to do that in just a bit. But if we take a look at this question, main idea, it is going to take a little bit more work because you have to understand, right, the full paragraph. But at least it's just one paragraph. It's not two. It's not a Shakespearean sonnet from the 1600s. So this may be a question that you want to prioritize, right? So we would go ahead and we would tackle that question. We're not moving on from it. And on the SAT, you get one question at a time, and then you can click on to the next one. So it would look kind of like this in a sense. So if you look at this question, it's asking which choice best describes the function of the underlying question. Wow, they want us to zoom into just one little part. We like a question like that, so we want to prioritize it. So yes, let's prioritize it. This one is great. Now this one, these tend to come up last in the reading. That's another hint that the reading section has ended, or the reading questions have come to an end. The logically completes the text question does tend to take more time and effort. It's a little bit less direct than just summarizing a paragraph. This one gets a little bit tricky. So for this one depends. It depends on your goal score. Again, if you're 1200 or below for your goal score, this may be a question you don't need to prioritize, right? This can be a question that you guess on. All right, now let's take a look at this one. It's asking what most effectively illustrates the claim, and they're going to give you answer choices, typically with quotes. Notice the actual text here is pretty short, so I would say this is a great one to also prioritize. All righty, this one as well. All the answer choices here are going to be just one single word, maybe a phrase, if that, right? Because they're asking which choice completes the text with the most logical and precise word or phrase. We want to always prioritize. We love this kind of question. And the reason we love it is because it is going to take you less time and effort. So yes, we absolutely want to prioritize this one. All right, now this one may take a little bit more time and effort because it's asking you to not only describe data from the graph, but you also have to make sure that the data is accurate and it supports this person's conclusion. So, two things going on. It depends on your score. It depends on how you feel about these questions, which again is why practice is everything. Through practice, that's how you find out which of these questions take you more time and effort. And you can also figure out why, what's causing you to maybe get a little bit thrown off by a question. So this one, I would say it depends on your score. Overall, typically we do recommend completing the ones about a graph because there tends to be a little bit less reading in terms of that. Now, ACT, you don't get one question per page, right? You're going to get passages first and those 10 questions connected to that passage. So instead of previewing and prioritizing questions, you're previewing and prioritizing easier reading passages. So here's our recommendation. Literary narrative, aka fiction, we recommend that this one always goes last. And the reason we recommend that is that statistically, that's actually the passage that students miss the most questions on. In my opinion, as an English teacher, I think it's because students are used to thinking deeply in English class. You're not supposed to just summarize stuff, right? Especially if you're a junior or a senior in high school, even sophomore, even freshman. Your teacher is going to push you to analyze, make text to world connections. So naturally, English teachers have you doing that typically on fiction, right? On novels, on poems. So when students tackle the fiction on the ACT, their gut instinct is to also think deeply. The answer can't be that obvious. It can't be that easy. Yes, it is. You need to just summarize, but that tends to be harder to do on the fiction. So for that reason, we recommend leaving it for last. Now, I have some students who love to follow a story and whose accuracy is super high on the fiction. If that's you, go for it. You can start with fiction first. The key is for you to start with whatever feels best for you. But in general, we recommend leaving that one for last. Now, if we take a look at these other options, we have humanities here, and it's really important to take a look at the title. We have The Quiet Sideman, and this is in 2008. Okay, so it's more recent. That sounds good. If that title sounds interesting to you, maybe you can start with that one first. It's really up to you. Now, natural science, that's another one. Maybe we'll do that one second. It's also relatively recent. Okay. And now social science. Notice this one mentions passage A, and then we have passage B. So this is our dual. And for dual, we want to always leave this for second to last. So most likely this would be our third one. But of course, it's going to depend on you. If you feel like fiction feels really great, maybe the dual is going to be last for you. That's again why practice is everything. All right, so we reordered the passages. I mentioned before what to do with fiction. That's going to go last. Dual second to last. Now, on to step number 2. Now we're going to, for the SAT, work, aka annotate the question. For the ACT, we are still looking at the questions. We're also going to reorder them. So let me ask you a question. When your homework assignment for, let's say, like US history is to read chapter 3 and answer the questions at the end, what do you typically do? Like, seriously, what do you really do? Are you going to read the full chapter and then answer all those questions? Or are you going to go to the questions and then find your answers in the chapter? Right? No shame, right? I've been there before too. The second option is going to take less time and effort, and we usually want to do less for homework, right? You also want to do less here. So going back to the SAT, we are going to prioritize this question as we've mentioned before. It's going to take a little bit less time and effort because it's just zooming into the function of an underlined question as opposed to the whole paragraph. Now we're going to work the question. So working the question, that means we're going to highlight, right? Use that highlighting tool on the digital SAT. so you know what to look out for. Which choice best describes the function? Okay, I'm definitely going to highlight function. I have to zoom into the underlying question, but I also do have to keep in mind what's said in the entire text. Okay, now in terms of reordering the questions here, the ACT test makers, they tend to give you more difficult stuff first. The stuff that's going to take more time and effort, like the fiction, it comes first. Questions too, right? Look at number 42. This is the first question of this passage. And it asks you for the primary purpose of the entire passage. What most students will do is they're going to go in order, and 42 is going to take a good chunk of time. Then they're going to have to rush through the rest. And what happens when we rush? We're more likely to make a mistake. So, for that reason, it doesn't matter that they gave 42 to us first. We don't have to do what they want us to. We're going to answer it last. Also, wouldn't it be way easier to answer something about the primary purpose after we completed like 9 other questions on it, right? All right, so now we're going to keep looking through these other questions. 43 says, based on the passage, a significant advantage of the Venus flytrap's requirement for multiple triggers is that it. Okay, so this doesn't tell me where to go, which means it's going to be a little bit more effort. I have to look for it, but I'm going to keep in mind the keywords that are popping out. When I say keywords, I mean words that we can find in the passage. So based on the passage doesn't matter to us. Like, of course, it's based on the passage. What else is it going to be based on? What really matters here is that we're looking at the Venus flytraps requirement for multiple triggers. That's what's really important here. So as we're reading, soon as we see something related to multiple triggers, we can stop there and answer number 43 on the spot. Okay. So then looking at number 45, that's also one that we definitely want to do sooner rather than later, because that's going to tell us exactly where to go. Right, line 6, line 27, 28 through 29. So we can just zoom into those key phrases instead of having to look at paragraphs of text. Same thing with number 46, right? Looking at the fact that it says second paragraph, it does tell us where to go, so we do like that one, but maybe that's not the one we do first. Something else that we'll keep in mind is that they bring up short-term memory, so that's another key word we want to be conscious of and on the lookout for. All right, looking at 47, this one says, according to the passage, which statement best explains why the Venus flytrap requires a second trigger hair to be touched? Okay, so now we're going to be on the lookout for a second trigger hair within a short amount of time. And we don't have to remember every single keyword that pops up because we're going to go back to the questions, but I have had students just write on top of a passage a few of the keywords they're afraid of forgetting. And in case you're wondering, Olga, that's going to take me way too much time, it really only takes a few seconds and it can prevent you from having to go back and forth, back and forth. Okay. Now, 48, this one's a little bit tricky because it's asking us about about this model predicting what if under which conditions a Venus flytrap will not close around an insect. So whenever they say not, even though they put it in all caps, if we're moving quickly, it's easy to ignore that question. So we don't want to start with a question like that. That's going to take a little bit more effort, but we're going to be on the lookout for Hodig and Siever's model, Venus flytrap. We'll be on the lookout for those names. Now, 49, this is the kind of question we always want to start with first because it tells us where to go, right? Right to line 67, and we just need to zoom in on one word. But that word actually doesn't matter. It's the context clues around it. Even still, we're looking at like 1 to 2 sentences maximum. All right, taking a look at 50. This one is saying, based on the passage, what potential criticism might be made of Volkov's testing of Hodig and Siever's model? They brought up Hodig and Siever again. And by the way, on both the ACT and SAT reading, and in general, repetition is never coincidental. If you see that they repeat something, I guarantee you that's important. So whenever you see it in the text, that's going to be your textual evidence. All right, now looking at 52, this one says, based on the passage and studying the Venus flytrap, Volkov and his colleagues made the most extensive use of which type of evidence? And we may not see the word evidence, we may not see the word extensive, but we know that we have to look out for Volkov and his colleagues whenever they're discussing the Venus flytrap. Okay, so we know that we definitely want to start with number 49 first. I would say number 45 is a great one to do second because we're just looking at those few phrases. They tell us where to go. 46 also tells us where to go, so I would probably do that one third. And then you can see how the rest feel. Don't worry about numbering every single one of them, especially if you're nervous about time. Okay, and by the way, with the ACT being such a tight time limit, 35 minutes for 40 questions, strategy is everything. All right, so we figured out which questions we want to prioritize for the SAT. We figured out reordering and which questions we want to prioritize on the ACT. The next step here is going to be actively working the passage. Keyword actively, right? Okay, so taking a look at this question right here, let's zoom into it, and I'm going to show you what it means to actively work it. Well, they ask about the underlying question, so I'm absolutely highlighting that, reminding myself to zoom back in on it. Okay. Now, it also says, let me just check one quick thing. I'll make sure that everyone here can, there we go. Thank you all for joining. By the way, I just gave you all permission to unmute yourselves if you need to. All right, jumping back in. So working the passage, I'm going to be on the lookout for any keywords that can help explain and that are tied to what's underlined. So it says, how lifelike are they? Many computer animators prioritize this question. Usually when they talk about who is doing something, that's something good to highlight, right? So nouns tend to be important. Many computer animators prioritize this question as they strive to create ever more realistic environments. Anytime they mention motivations, especially if it's fiction, this one's nonfiction, but especially for fiction, it's really, really important because it tends to be part of the right answer. All right, generally, while characters in computer animated films appear highly exaggerated, environments and lighting are carefully engineered to mimic reality. Okay, I'm seeing some repetition come up. They said lifelike, now they mention mimicking reality. Now, something I want you to always be on the lookout for in both SAT and ACT. The minute that you see a word like however, yet, but, please take note of it, highlight it, underline it if it's ACT. It's guaranteed to be part of your textual evidence, like 99.9% of the time. All right, so it says, but some animators, such as Pixar's Sanjay Patel, are focused on a different question. Ooh, we got contrast. So they're focused on a different question. I'm going to highlight that. Rather than asking first whether the environments and lighting they're creating are convincingly lifelike, Patel and others are asking whether these elements reflect their film's unique stories. So over here, more contrast words rather than, right? They're asking about reflecting the film's unique stories instead of them being convincingly lifelike. Okay, so it's not about the lifelike part, it's about are they true to the film's stories. So this is what working the passage, actively working the passage looks like on the SAT. Please take advantage of that highlighting tool. Now, working the passage on the ACT means we're not reading for detail. We're not reading for like deep comprehension. You're kind of just getting yourself familiar with it and underlining where you're going to find your textual evidence. So you're skimming/scanning within about 3 minutes. You're still reading through everything, but just not in a very detailed manner. So let's say you read a paragraph and you're like, what did I just read? Resist the urge to read that whole paragraph again. That's going to take a lot of time. If anything, maybe read or skim through the first and last sentences of a paragraph because the first sentence introduces the topic, last sentence summarizes it. So really important. I know that it's very tempting and it may even be uncomfortable to move on when you don't understand fully what a paragraph says, but we don't need to reread it because if a question asks about it, we're going to reread it anyways. So what you're gonna do is you're skimming, you're scanning, you're taking about 3 minutes and you're keeping your pencil active. I can't stress that part enough. Otherwise, you will zone out. These are very boring passages. So here's what that looks like. We saw Venus flytrap come up a whole bunch in the questions. So that means every time we see it, we're definitely going to go ahead and highlight, well, circle, underline, because they don't let you bring a highlighter for the ACT. And here are the things that you always want to underline or circle. So keywords from the questions. You're also going to focus on any proper nouns. So these are names, typically things that are capitalized, numbers, italics, like how we have circled here, quotes, parentheses, dashes, contrasting words, like but, yet, however. And the reason we recommend that you always underline these specific items is because they tend to come up as textual evidence. They tend to come up as questions. We already caught on to their pattern because for the most part, the people who make these tests are not super duper creative, right? They're not going to switch things up dramatically. The traps they throw at us are relatively predictable, and we take advantage of that. So for example, looking here, we have the italics, we have the names, something else that I see here, and this is very subtle, but they also mention numbers in word form. So we have 2 over here and 20 over here. I guarantee you there's a question tied to that. And then 1 over here. So you're skimming, you're underlining, you're reading quickly, underlining, and you're only underlining. Oh, let me actually mention this part. Only underline or circle what the questions ask about and not what feels important. And here's the reason why. I see this all the time with my students, especially strong readers. They'll underline something and I'll ask, why did you underline that? Oh, it felt important. Okay. Is there a question about it? No. Mm. So if it's not asked as a question, we underline it. Now, when we're looking for our evidence, we're going to be distracted by something that is irrelevant to the question. So here is my best advice for you. And it feels very weird to say as an English teacher, this is literally the opposite of how English teachers are trained to teach you. But if the question does not ask about it, we do not care about it. It's not a true reading test, right? You're almost kind of playing a game. And with using these strategies, you're going to win the game, not the ACT. So here's another look of something else that we want to make sure that we're always underlining, circling. Let me make sure I also included parentheses. Yes. So parentheses here, they're coming through. We have names, right? Those proper nouns are important. Again, more of these brackets or parentheses, that's always going to matter. Okay. And then, something else, we have second coming up. So anything related to numbers is important. They mentioned short-term memory in one of the questions. So we're going to make sure that is also underlined or circled. Same thing here. You just keep going, you're reading and you're keeping your pencil active, right? Actively working that text. Okay. So you finished working the passage either for the SAT or ACT. Now, for the SAT, what you're going to do is you have to ignore those answer choices. You're going to do the same thing on the ACT. Don't go straight to those answers. That's how they get you. And we're not going to let them get you. You have to think or speak for yourself. Don't worry about predicting the right answer. Some students are nervous, like, oh, I made a prediction and I didn't see it in the answer choices. That's okay. That's not the point. The point is that you took that moment to think for yourself, which means you're not letting College Board or the ACT guide your thinking towards a trap. They literally hire psychologists when they make these answer choices. They know how to trick students. So we're not even going to give them a chance to do that. Something else I want y'all to keep in mind. Let's say you go holiday shopping, or maybe you're getting a birthday gift for someone and you're not entirely sure what to get them. You walk into a store, the salesperson takes you all over. You're thinking, okay, I don't think I even need to look at this, or maybe I do. You start doubting yourself. You finally, after a long time, pick something out. You walk out the store and you're like, I guess this is it. I hope they like it. But let's say you walk into that store and you're like, oh, I don't know exactly what to get this person, but I know that they really love lavender. So I'm going to make sure that I only look at stuff with lavender. I'm not going to waste my time in the rest of the store. Same logic here. You have to come in with an answer ready, like a solid idea and just a summary. That's all you have to do. Just summarize your textual evidence. And if you think about it, your English teachers expect you to do way harder work than this. Imagine if all you did in your English class was write summaries for your essays. Your English teacher would be very upset with you. You are not passing that class. You're supposed to analyze deeply because your English teachers care about what you think, right? The SAT, the ACT, they don't. They only want you to summarize the text because think about it this way, and this is going to be the case for any standardized test. How can every student, not just in America, but this is taken internationally, how can every student across the world come to the same correct answer if they're all thinking deeply and thinking creatively and making text to world connections? It's not going to happen. So everything on both of these tests is just a summary. So if the reading stresses you out, hopefully that makes you feel a little bit better because you really don't have to do much beyond summarizing. Even when they say inference, everything is tied to a summary of your textual evidence. Everything is grounded in textual evidence. So here's what this step looks like. Actually, as I mentioned before, we're ignoring the answers, right? We're starting with easiest questions. We're covering those answers. We're summarizing. We're eliminating. By the way, as you eliminate, you're eliminating what doesn't match what you read. I want you to always look for what's wrong. That is way easier to spot. Kind of like, I don't know if you have that friend in your group who maybe has a crush on someone and the whole friend group is like, oh man, don't do it. Don't do it. It's not a good idea. But your friend just sees the positives in that person, right? If you're looking for something right, you may find it even in something that's wrong. So instead, look for what's wrong. It's way easier to spot flaws. Now, here are the common things that are wrong. These are the common traps. Loaded language, meaning that it's very extreme, it's very absolute. It may say things like always, only, never. Typically, that's not the right answer. The SAT and the ACT, they like nuance, they like layers to your thinking. They tend to not be very absolute. Negative connotation, unless you're in the dual passage, if something is very negative, solid chance that's not the right answer. Opinion-based words also tend to be traps. So anything that sounds like it can be subjective, like if something is um, pleasant or if something is beautiful, well, that depends on the person, right? Everything has to be grounded in the text. And if the text doesn't say it, we can't pick it. Okay, so here's an example of this on the SAT. I am going to cover up our answer choices because I know it's going to be very, very tempting. Let's do our speak for ourselves step. Take a moment, drop something into the chat. Let me know what would be your summary for this paragraph and specifically for this line. You can either unmute yourself, drop it into the chat, take your time, go ahead and refresh your memory on it. And if you want, you can also reach out and send a message directly to me if you're a little bit nervous about other people seeing it. It's just about a minute and then we'll jump into it together. Alrighty, so let's work on this together. Looking at the question itself, how lifelike are they? Well, just to summarize it, I'm not going to think too deeply, right? It's not that deep. Summarizing it, I would say question about mm, 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 animations mimicking reality, right? Because the they is about the animations. And by the way, anytime there is something that is vague, like the word they, something else you can do is something called syntax surgery, where you draw a circle around it, or maybe you can highlight it. And then if this was ACT, you would be able to draw that arrow into what it's referring to. Just see. So how lifelike are they? Environments. They're talking about those environments, the lighting. So ACT, you could draw that arrow. I'm sorry, ACT, yes, you can draw that arrow. SAT, you would have to just highlight it creatively. Okay, so they're asking if the animations, the environments mimic reality. But throughout the paragraph, they're talking about a few things. Right away, they're saying what the computer animators prioritize. So the priority used to be about environments. And then, right, there was that contrast, which is always important to the SAT and ACT. Now they're focused on the film's unique stories. Okay, now that we spoke for ourselves, right, we covered it, we spoke for ourselves. Let's focus on taking out the trash. I'm gonna hide this now. Okay, let's start with A. A says it reflects a primary goal that many computer animators have for certain components of the animations they produce. Well, they did say that was a priority and it was tied to that. I'm not really seeing anything wrong with A, but let's make sure that B, C, and D are horrible. Sometimes it's about picking the best of the bad answers. The answer you pick may still sound weird, but it's just way better than the other ones. B says it represents a concern of computer animators who are more interested in creating unique backgrounds and lighting effects than realistic ones. Huh, interesting. I don't think I ever read them talking about trying to make anything unique for backgrounds. So if they don't mention it, we can't pick it. B is going to be trash because they literally never mention unique backgrounds. C says it conveys the uncertainty among many computer animators about how to create realistic animations using current technology. There was uncertainty? Let's double check, because I don't see it in my speak for myself, but let's double check in the text. Literally nowhere here do they do they mention uncertainty, not knowing something. They already know how to create the realistic animations. That's not the issue. Okay, so C is also trash because there's no uncertainty. There's no issue about the how. They got that. D, it illustrates a reaction that audiences typically have to the appearance of characters created by computer animators. Okay, do they ever even mention the audience in any way? They don't. So if they don't mention it, we cannot pick it. So D is also trash. I'm gonna get rid of D. They literally never talk about the audience. Looking at the speak for ourselves, it has to be answer choice A. Every part of it checks out. So as I mentioned before, if they don't mention it, we cannot pick it. Okay, so that is covering, speaking, and using the process of elimination. Let's take a look at how you would apply that to the ACT. You're gonna find your window because on the SAT, it's one question, right? One question next to the text. Soon as you go to the next page, it's a whole different question, whole different text. But ACT is not like that. You get that passage, you get the 10 questions. You have to figure out where your textual evidence is for the questions that don't tell you where to go. So for the window, this should be a few lines above and below the line reference. So if they do tell you where to go, just double check and look a little bit before, a little bit after. If there are some lead words, like when it was mentioning Seedick and Hover's model, okay, as soon as we find that model, we're going to also read a little bit before, a little bit after. A little bit is the key word, right? Just a few lines. Then you're going to write the question number, really important. Write the question number in the margin so you have a roadmap. And you're going to read carefully, literally, and for context. So super, super, super important, especially literally. You have to be so ridiculously literal on the ACT because a lot of times the correct answer, it almost feels like they copy and pasted it from the passage, right? It's that close to the point where I've heard students say so many times, oh, that felt too obvious, but that felt too easy. That's kind of the evil genius of this test. It seems way more complicated than it really is. So the more simply you approach it, the less likely you are to fall for their traps and to get frustrated. Right. And that's my goal for today. I want to help take away the frustration, any stress that's caused by either one of these exams, especially for the reading. Okay. Now, um, I have a question for you all. I want you to consider this. Before you ever look at the answer choices, I want you to pretend it's a short response question and determine what you think the answer should be. And that should be directly supported from the passage. Remember, it's an open book test. So why are we trying to memorize? If you're like, well, Olga, I don't have time to go back to the text, I guarantee you that you do. Because if you're relying on your memory, well, there's a solid chance you misremembered. The other thing is, if you're just relying on your memory, you may spend more time trying to get to the right answer. You don't even have to paraphrase, like straight up, you can just use the same language in that text for your summary because then you're more likely to see how it matches up with the answer choices. Now, I have actually, you know what? I'm gonna ask you this question next. For the process of elimination, the test writers want to hide the correct answer, right? Remember, they're going out of their way to trick you. So for that reason, it's easier to find the wrong answers first. They make those wrong answers super tempting and they put certain words that they know will make you want to choose them because, especially if you're moving quickly, they put words that did come up in the text. You're like, oh, they did mention that. You'll want to circle it. But what they do is they take for those trap answers, they take the words that were mentioned in the passage and they kind of twist them around so that it's not really what the passage said. Almost like if, I don't know if you've ever had this happen to you or in your friend group, you send a text, or maybe you get a text, who knows, and someone misinterprets it. And you're like, whoa, I never said that. I literally never said that. Those are the ACT trap answers. They take words that are written and just twist them around. So I have a question for you all. You can please write this in the chat or unmute yourselves. And this may seem simple, but you'll see where I'm going in just a sec. What color is this slide? Feel free to unmute yourselves. So you should have seen the question in the chat and you should be able to respond right back. Think you can also use the question and answer if the chat is not working for you. Thank you. Excellent. Okay. Thank you. Appreciate you. So the color of this slide is white. You're probably like, duh, Olga, where are you going with this? Okay, my next question. What do cows drink? Hmm. Oh, okay, you got that. That's right. All right, so y'all are on top of it. It is water, but a lot of times people will think milk, right? Because you think white cow milk. So that's what they do. They try to prime these trap words to make it really tempting, but they don't got anything on you. You came ready. Thank you, by the way, for dropping that into the chat. Okay, so let's keep going and let's practice. So in terms of your words in context, these should always be the first questions that you do. They're going to take the least amount of time. And you don't have to know the word they ask about. It's actually better if you cross it out because in the answer choices, technically all of those answers are definitions. They just pick words that have multiple meanings. So it's really important that you ignore that word, cross it out completely. Instead, read the context that are a few lines above, a few lines below. Then you want to speak for yourself, right? Because we're not letting them guide our thoughts. We are in charge. So we're going to think of a word of our own, even if you're like, oh, I don't know if this is the right one. That's okay. Even if the word you pick doesn't match with what's in the answers, just taking that moment so that you know roughly what to look for is going to set you up for success. All right, then next up, your process of elimination. You are taking out the trash. Anything that doesn't match up, we're getting rid of it. Okay, so let's take a look at how that appears on the SAT. Again, it's going to be one question per slide, essentially, or one question and its text at a time. So looking at what this question says, because we always work the question before we work the passage, it says, as used in the text, which is confirmation, it's all about context clues. What does the phrase a singular most nearly mean? Now, they're going to put in trap answers that we are going to think of first when it comes to a word like singular. This word doesn't actually matter. We're not giving them the opportunity to trick us or to activate those connections. We have to stick to the text. So now we're going to actively work the passage. It says the following text is adapted from Nathaniel Hawthorne's 1837 story, Dr. Heidegger's Experiment. The main character, a physician, is experimenting with rehydrating a dried flower. By the way, the digital SAT does seem to be favoring more of these like 1800s, 1900s type of passages. And I believe the reason for that is um, when a when a novel, poem, any type of literary work, I believe it's 95 years. When it's 95 years old, then you are allowed to publish it without any copyright issues. So by using these older passages, College Board doesn't have to write new passages, aka they save time and money. So what we've been seeing is more of these older texts coming up, which is also why it's important to practice, because how often do we read things from the 1800s, right? But jumping back in, now I'm going to actively work the passage. Ooh, hold on one sec. Let me try that again. Okay. At first, the rose lay lightly on the surface of the fluid, appearing to imbibe none of its moisture. I'm only going to focus on the words that are digestible. So if you're like, Olga, what is imbibe? We're not going to stress it. That's not the most important part. What I'm going to zoom in on is the subject. We're talking about a rose. Okay, the rose. What's the rose doing? It's on the surface. There's a fluid and something, none of its moisture. Okay, rose, fluid. Doesn't seem like it's maybe taking in the moisture. Okay. Soon, however is always important. They are obsessed with asking a question related to that because whenever we use those contrasting words, the idea shifts. And both SAT and ACT are obsessed with testing if a student caught on to the idea shifting. So it says soon, however, a blank change began to be visible. Oh, so now something is visible. And if it says began to be visible, that means it wasn't visible before. So whatever happened, it was major because now we can actually see it. Okay. Now it says the crushed and dried petals stirred and assumed a deepening tinge of crimson, as if the flower were reviving from a death-like slumber. All right, that's intense. That's a lot. Any words with strong connotation, look to them for your context clues. So let's think about what's happening here and let's speak for ourselves. Okay, so what we see is that we have this rose, and then there was a change that became visible, and then it was intense. Okay, so if we're going to describe the change, so our word describes the change. I'm going to say maybe intense even. Maybe noticeable, something related to something major. Because look at what's happening. We have the petals are stirring, there's a deepening tinge, it's reviving from a death-like slumber. So it's almost kind of like this amazing situation happening where it went from looking, I'm going to assume, somewhat dead, not taking in moisture, to now coming to life. Okay, so I'm going to take a look now at our answer choices and let's see what definitely doesn't match up. So in the chat, go ahead and write which answer choices are trash. Which ones do you think we gotta get rid of? Yes, B, excellent. You got that. Okay, disagreeable. There's nothing about something being wrong, disagreeable, acceptable. Yes, excellent. Also, not about accepting anything being okay. All right. Is this change lonely or is it extraordinary? What matches more with the speak for ourselves? Yes, let's go. You got it. Excellent. Nicely done, Navina. Let me know if I pronounced your name correctly. Please let me know if I did not. Okay, nicely done. Amazing. All right, let's keep going. Looking at this next one, we would do a very similar strategy. For the sake of time, I'm going to hold off on this one to make sure we get through as much as possible. If there's more time at the end, we can definitely jump back in, but you would just go ahead and do the same exact strategy. If you're looking at these vocab words and you're like, oh, I do not know what these mean, don't stress, practice, look up your root words, and worst case scenario, focus on connotation, like repudiates. That has a very negative connotation. So if we're looking for a positive word, we can't choose repudiates. But if we're looking for a negative word, we may want to hold on to that one. My other recommendation, when you see words that you are not familiar with, I'm going to recommend that you focus first on the words that you do know. So if you see the words that you know and they definitely don't fit, get rid of them. So get rid of whatever doesn't match the speak for yourself. And then let's say there's a word that you do know and it fits perfectly, go with it. Don't even worry about the ones that you're less familiar with. Okay, so let's keep going. Do, 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 do. Now, in terms of ACT, this is more of what it's going to look like. So just like before, they're asking us to look at this one word in this line. So we're going to work the question first, as always. We're not going to stress this word, though. This word's going to be distracting if we focus on it because demonstrated, all of these are meanings of demonstrated, right? So now let's zoom into this. We're also going to ignore it over here. And I recommend you also cross it out because otherwise your brain is just going to really focus in on that and we don't want it to. So let's go ahead and read this one out. Subsequent research supports this model. Alexander Volkov and his colleagues at Oakwood University in Alabama first blank that it is indeed electricity that causes the Venus flytrap to close. I'm gonna pause there for a sec. Setting is important and the people are important too. So we have this person, colleagues, we're at a university, we're talking about scientific type of stuff, research. So it's important to consider the setting, it's academic, okay? And the fact that it says indeed is like, all right, it's a fact, right? They figured it out, done. To test the model, they rigged up very fine electrodes and applied an electrical current to the open lobes of the trap. Okay, that's just telling us how they figured it out. We're not going to focus in on that too much. So I'm going to go ahead and do the speak for ourselves real quick. So we know that it's academic setting. We have research going on, science experiments. So I'm going to say demonstrated. I'm going to say that means maybe proved, maybe showed. So looking at that, let's see what matches up and then what doesn't. Let's start with taking out the trash. Go ahead in the chat. Let me know what absolutely does not match our speak for ourselves. Yes, nicely done. Protest. There's no protest going on here, right? What else is trash? D, yes, they're not arguing. They said indeed. There's no arguing. They said it's a fact. Okay. Now, established versus performed. What matches more of an academic setting? Right? So performed, we're going to get rid of that because performances are more about like theater, arts. Established is the one that we want to go with because that's more of that academic setting. That's the indeed. Boom, it's established. We got this. Okay. All right, let's keep going. Now, something else they'll ask about is tone. And when it comes down to tone, we're still doing the same type of strategy as before. We still have to work the question first. We still have to speak for ourselves. If there's unfamiliar words, we're not going to look at them first. We're going to look at what we do know. Okay, so we have to look at dawdling insect, happily meanders, unassuming bugs encounter. And then they're asking us about tone. Okay, so we worked the question. Let's go ahead and make sure that we are working the text and coming up with our own idea. So it's mentioning how Dionai only wants the spring closed when it's sure that the dawdling insect visiting its surface is large enough to be worth its time. Okay, dawdling. What stands out to me is that we have a scientific name and then we got dawdling insect. So those are two very different vibes, right? We're going to keep that in mind. Then we have something like happily meanders. And something else I'm considering is that this is like a very scientific passage. We're talking about research and university. And now we got things like happily meanders, which I typically wouldn't read in like an academic journal. Then it says, how does the plant encode and store the information from the unassuming bugs encounter? Look at the difference here, right? Between the scientific name versus insect versus bug. Bug is so casual. So in my speak for myself, I'm gonna say that it's chill vibes, it's pretty casual, um, and overall it seems relatively positive, right? Nothing super negative is going on here. All right, let's take some time to eliminate. We're going to take out the trash and look for what's wrong. Okay, what definitely doesn't match our speak for ourselves? D, yeah, it's not making fun of anything, right? Done, get rid of that. What else doesn't match chill, casual, positive? Yes, yes, you're right. Because melodramatic, right? If we look at, even if we don't know that word, we know dramatic. So by the way, another little English teacher trick for you. If you see a bigger word that you're unfamiliar with, try to spot a smaller word within that bigger word. It's connected. So melodramatic, I don't know if any of you have younger siblings, especially if they're like toddlers or even in elementary school. Think about how dramatic they get, the like tantrums that they throw. We don't have that type of energy here. All right. Now, academic or informal. Does bugs feel really academic? Yeah, hey, let's go. Nicely done. It is C. All right. It's informal. It's saying bugs. That's not academic. If it was academic, all of the terms that they're asking about should have a scientific name. It should have something that would show up in a journal. Typically wouldn't see like happily in a journal or bug even. Nicely done. All right, let's keep going. Do, 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 do. Line reference. We love to do these. That's what you're going to do next, second, after you do the words in context. And context here is still everything. Context is important on every part of the reading. So you're going to read a little bit before, a little bit after, and you're reading literally, so literally. Like, we're not going to go below the surface. You actually, like from an English teacher perspective, you have to be a weak reader. Don't make connections. Don't think deeply, don't analyze. Even when they say inference, it's still not like a true inference. You still need to think very literally. You're gonna write the question number in the margins, again, to provide that roadmap for yourself. And as always, we speak, we think for ourselves first, and then we take out that trash. Okay, so let's go ahead on to this one next. So notice we're going to write 46 right next to the first line that they mention here, right? They mention a whole paragraph, lines 15 to 31. So we're going to want to start and put that question number right next to the first line that they mention. Now it's saying the discussion of short-term memory primarily functions to, all right, so we have to look out for short-term memory. Here's what I want you to always ignore. And if this word comes up on the SAT, ignore it too. Functions. I've noticed when students think about the word functions, when they read that, it activates this deeper thought process. And you're like, wait, what is the function? What is it doing? Why is it doing that? Everything is a summary, right? So whenever they ask you functions, they're just asking you, what is the summary? Every single question is, what is the summary of these lines? Okay, so if we take a look and we work the text here, it's already done for us. So we're coming back to this paragraph after we already skimmed through everything and actively work the text. It says, we can look at this system as analogous to short-term memory. Okay, well, analogous, that may be an unfamiliar word, but if we think about analogy, that's about comparisons. Okay, so right away I'm like, we're probably gonna have some type of comparison here. Let me write that out up top. Okay. So it says first, the fly trap encodes the information, forms the memory that something it doesn't know what has touched one of its hairs. Then it stores this information for a number of seconds, retains the memory, and finally retrieves this information, recalls the memory once a second hair is touched. If a small ant takes a while to get from one hair to the next, the trap will have forgotten the first touch by the time the ant brushes up against the next hair. That was a lot of information. Don't stress if you're like, Olga, what? What we can zoom in on, because we're not going to reread stuff too much. It says forms the memory. Looking at all of these parentheses, right? Forms the memory, retains the memory, recalls the memory, short-term memory, all this repetition. But I'm like, a Venus flytrap, can it actually remember stuff like the way that a human can, right? Going back to it being a comparison, it's comparing to what humans do. So then it says if a small ant, oh, I'm sorry, I already read that one. In other words, so we're not going to reread any of that. If it went over your head, it's okay. Don't stress. This is also a little bit boring. Unless you're passionate about fly traps, then I'm sorry if I insulted your passion. But when it says in other words, it's about to summarize. So you know what? Let's not stress. Let's just zoom into that next one. It loses the storage of the information, does enclose, and the ant happily meanders on. How does the plant encode and store the information from the unassuming bug's encounter with the first hair? How does it remember the first touch in order to react upon the second? That was a lot, but focusing on just everything as a whole and things that kept getting repeated. They kept mentioning things related to memory, encode, store, remember. So it might speak for myself, even if I'm not totally sure what it said, because we don't have to actually understand the science. Might speak for ourselves. Let's say it's a comparison to memory. And to me, it looks like it explained what a Venus flytrap does. Even if I'm like, I don't know what it actually does, that's okay. We don't really need to know because we're going to take out the trash by focusing on what does not match, what was never mentioned, right? Because if they don't mention it in the text, we cannot select it as an answer choice. All right, let's take a look at A. Clarify an explanation of what prompts the Venus flytrap to close. Huh. Well, that does match up with the speak for ourselves, right? And it does talk about what a Venus flytrap does. So we'll hold off on A. A seems decent. Okay, B says advance a controversial hypothesis about the function of electrical charges found in the leaf of the Venus flytrap. Where did they mention electric charges? And I'll move the speak for ourselves box just in case. Take a look through. Let me know, did they mention electrical charges? You can say yes or no in the chat. Scanning through, they literally never even said the word electric. So if they don't mention it, we can't pick it. So for that reason, B has to be trash. Out of there. It's not going to work. Okay, so now let's take a look at the next one, answer choice C. C says stress the distinction between the strategies of the Venus flytrap and the strategies of human beings. Huh. Well, if they're going to talk about distinction, distinction is difference. Was this paragraph about saying how different the Venus flytrap is from humans? Mm, not really. It actually showed a similarity. It's not a distinction. And also strategies, right? That's vague. And also strategies, plural. Where are they? Because this is only really one if you think about it. So for that reason, C is out. Let's look at D. Emphasize the Venus flytrap's capacity for retaining detailed information about its prey. Ooh, that is tempting. It does talk about retention like memory, but let's double check. Where do they talk about it being detailed information? Let's double check that part. Hmm. Okay, so that part is missing, right? They're not talking about details. And if D was the heart of that paragraph, if it was the right answer, they should have mentioned it in the topic, concluding sentence. They should have mentioned it throughout. We don't really have details. They just said retrieves this information. That's not the same as detailed. So because it doesn't talk about detailed information, we're going to get rid of D. Answer choice A has to be the right one. Even if you weren't initially thinking that was the right one, the others are just way worse. All right, let's keep going. Now, detail questions. We love these because they tell us to zoom in on just one part. And taking a look at this paragraph, it's not huge, right? So this is the type of question that we would preview and prioritize. Then we're going to work the question. Please don't read the passage first because you're going to just keep rereading it. You have to know what to look for before you start reading. So we have to look for why ecologists are worried about Pando. Okay, let's take a look. Utah is home to Pando. Okay, here we go. This is important because it came up in the question. A colony of about 47,000 quaking aspen trees that all share a single root system. Okay, they define it, so I'm going to make sure I include that in working the passage. Pando is one of the largest single organisms by mass on Earth. Okay, largest single organisms. Oh, here's our contrasting word. I hope you're seeing the pattern now. And like I said, these people are predictable. But ecologists are worried that its growth is declining in part because of grazing by animals. The ecologists say that strong fences could prevent deer from eating young trees and help pandas start thriving again. Okay, so we have a solution at the end, but the question is not asking about solutions, it's asking about worries. So we're gonna ignore those answers if you're looking at them. Please fight the temptation to do so. Let's do our speak for ourselves. Okay, so Pando is declining because of grazing by animals. Notice I'm not even really paraphrasing because why? We don't need to do all that work, right? It's not an essay for your English teacher. And especially with the SAT, especially with College Board, their answers tend to be less direct compared to the ACT. ACT is almost word for word what was mentioned in the text, typically. But for SAT, if you're doing too much paraphrasing, it's going to be harder to see what lines up. So don't be afraid to just use the same language in the passage itself. Okay, so now I'm going to remove this so we can see. It's time to now, after we spoke for ourselves, let's take out the trash. Okay, so let's take a look and see which one of these is wrong. Go ahead, take your time, scan through, and drop into the chat which of these answers you think is trash. What should we get rid of? What did they never say? Yes. Okay. Oh, hold on one sec. Okay, we check. All right, I'm seeing a few different responses. Okay, with answer choice A, that one, it does feel a little bit weird. Let's hold off on it because it does somewhat match with declining. I'm with you. It's not exactly what was said, but answer choice C, that's the one that they literally never mention, right? It's not about blocking the fences. The fences are the solution. So that is not the right answer. Okay. Hmm. What else did they just never mention? Which answer choice is irrelevant to the text or not supported by the text, I should say? Yes, they literally never even mention the word root, right? It's not, oh wait, I'm sorry, they did. Single root system, but they didn't say anything about the root system being the problem. They never said the root system can't support more trees. The root system was just part of the description. It wasn't part of the problem. The problem is everything I have highlighted here in pink. It's everything that came after the word but. So it's not about the root system not supporting, that's out. A and B are really close, really, really close. But let's ground ourselves in textual evidence. Between A and B, looking at what's highlighted in pink, growth is declining. If we're going to be strong readers, or if we're going to overthink, which I know I tend to overthink, I don't know about any of you, I may think, oh, well, if its growth is declining, then it probably isn't producing young trees. Ah, probably, right? Soon as you're like, well, if I think about it this way, you've gone too far. You're overthinking, you're doing too much. They never said anything about young trees, especially isn't producing young trees anymore. If it never produces young trees, that's it, it's gonna die, right? It's not about that. It's not about the young trees. It's the fact that its growth is declining, meaning it can't be growing at the same rate. The growth is declining. Decline also refers to rates, right? So we have growth there, rate here. There's just more textual support for A, even though I'm going to be honest with you, I don't really like A as an answer, but it's just better than the rest. And if any of these questions are throwing you off, please, please, please don't stress. This is not how you're used to experiencing reading. This is not true reading comprehension. It's almost like playing a game. And you have to know now what is throwing you off so you can practice and improve. So if you guessed an answer that wasn't right, please don't beat yourself up. Be kind to yourself, grow from it, because your missed questions are going to tell you way more than the ones you even get right. Okay, let's keep going. All right, I'm gonna skip this one because we already did a detail from SAT. Let's go ahead and do this detail question next. They're asking about, right, going back to working the question first. They're asking about Volkov and his colleagues, and we have to look out for some type of evidence. It's asking, based on the passage and studying the Venus trap, Volkov and his colleagues made the most extensive use of which type of evidence? Okay, well, here they mention Volkov. Perfect. And here's the experiments, okay? Because they're talking about evidence that has to be tied to an experiment. I'm going to really zoom in to this part here. I have the question number next to the line number. And it says, when they modify this experiment by altering the amount of electrical current, Volkov could determine the exact electrical charge needed for the trap to close. Oh, interesting. Okay, so that sounds like evidence to me, actually, right? They repeated electrical. Any repetition is important. And it says something like as long as 14 microcoulombs, a tiny bit more than blah, 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 flowed between the two electrodes. We don't really have to stress all that. We just know that again, it's talking about something electrical. So in our speak for ourselves, I'm going to say that this has to be tied to electrical current or charge because they're altering it. Altering, so they have to be changing it. Altering, changing. Okay, now that we ignored those answer choices, covered them up, we spoke for ourselves, let's take out the trash. Okay, taking a look at A. Did they ever mention mathematical models? Yeah, that part is missing because trust me, if they mentioned it, they would explicitly say it. ACT is very literal on its own too. It would have to say this mathematical model. They never said that. So we're going to get rid of A for that reason. It's out of there. All right. What else can we get rid of? Hmm. What else just doesn't work? Yes, you got it. D does not work because if this was the right answer, what should we see? Well, they should mention published theories of scientists and earlier models. We don't have earlier models, we don't have published theories, we don't have other scientists. It's just this one scientist. That's it. That's all who is mentioned here. All right. Looking at the other options here, B says analysis of data collected from previous researchers' work involving the Venus flytraps response to electricity. Hmm. They don't say that this came from anyone before. They never said it's previous. So that is also trash. They literally never mentioned it. But notice, response to electricity. That part is right, right? So be on the lookout. They like to put half right, half wrong traps because if you're only looking for what's right, you're going to get stuck between B and C. But looking at our concrete textual evidence, they just never mention these other researchers. So B is trash, and we have to go with C that says information obtained from monitoring the Venus flytrap's response to varying amounts of electrical current. Well, electrical current charge altering, changing, that matches up with varying. So every part of this matches up. And if you're ever stuck between two, there's two steps for you to take. One is to go back to what the question is asking, because there is a solid chance that as you're doing the process of elimination, as you're looking at your passage, there's a solid chance you forgot what it was asking. The other thing is only one of your answers will have concrete textual evidence. It is literally impossible for there to be two correct answers or two answers that have textual evidence. I promise you, one of those will be missing some concrete evidence. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead on to main idea to make sure we get through some more of these question types. So main idea, it's like the heart of the paragraph, the passage. It's the most important thought about the topic, and it should be said throughout the paragraph, right? It shouldn't just be like a little minor point. It's the main idea. Now, if they ask you about the passage, it's also what the author wants to communicate. So again, if the author repeats things, that is not coincidental. That means it is important. Now, here are some trap answers for you to be on the lookout for. If anything is too general, too broad, too narrow, negative, or extreme, we want to be on the lookout for those. These are all of our red flags right here. These are red flags. We want to avoid them. And too broad could be like this passage that we were just working on about Venus flytraps. Too broad would say plants in general. Too narrow may talk about just one plant that was used on a specific day, or it may zoom in even more closely than what the text is saying. Like it may talk about a specific cell in the Venus flytrap, but if the passage never talked about cells, we're not going to talk about it either or select it as an answer. If it's too negative, too extreme, there's never going to be concrete textual evidence for that. Okay, so let me see actually. Yeah, let's go ahead and do this one. So again, we're going to work our question first. We know that this is about the main idea of the text. All right. So now let's take a look at the paragraph itself. Now we're going to actively work the passage. So this says biologists have predicted that birds' feather structures vary with habitat temperature. Okay, so who is doing this is important. This is a prediction, and it's about these feather structures changing with habitat temperature. And you see what I mean by them being predictable? Here we go. Here's our contrasting words. So that means this sentence is going to be really important. But this hadn't been tested in mountain environments. So this seems to be like a flaw. Okay. So they know or they predicted that the feather structures are changing based on the temperature, but they didn't test it in the mountain. Okay, ornithologist Sahas Barvi studied feathers from 249 songbird species inhabiting different elevations and thus experiencing different temperatures in the Himalaya mountains. That was a lot of words. We have someone, believe that's like a bird researcher or scientist. They're studying these feathers and they are doing this in the mountains. Okay. He found that feathers of high elevation species not only have a greater proportion of warming downy sections. Okay, I'm going to pause there because if I keep reading, it's going to be too much. So, feathers of high elevation species, oh, let me make sure that's a little bit more neat. They have a greater proportion of warming, okay, than do feathers of low elevation species. And here's another contrast, okay, but high elevation species feathers also tend to be longer, providing a thicker layer of insulation. Okay, so now we're going to summarize this. I'm not going to think too deep. We're not going to stress over it. I'm just going to talk about what comes up here. So initially, they said biologists predicted about feather structures, but not in mountains. Okay. And then we found out that high elevation, they have more warming, downy sections and longer feathers. They said it's more insulation. Okay. So I'm just summarizing. That is it. We're not going to think too deep. We're not going to analyze. Let's take a look. Take your time and let me know what was never really mentioned. And think about what's being compared. It's about high elevation versus low elevation. Hmm. So, for example, A says Barb's investigation shows that some species of Himalayan songbirds have evolved feathers that better regulate body temperature than do the feathers of other species, contradicting previous predictions. Well, it's not necessarily a contrast all the way. It's kind of supporting that prediction, right? Saying that the feathers are going to be different depending on habitat temperature. Okay. The other thing is they're comparing high elevation versus low elevation, but it's still birds. It's still the same species. So it's not comparing them to other species. For that reason, A is out. Okay. Let's look at B. Barr found an association between habitat temperature and feather structure along Himalayan songbirds, lending new support to a general prediction. Okay. Maybe that's it, because it does talk about temperature, feather structure. It is in the Himalayas. Okay, even if we're like, I don't know about that one, let's hold off. C says Barv discovered that songbirds have adapted to their environment by growing feathers without flat and smooth sections, complicating an earlier hypothesis. Hmm. Well, the thing is here, it's not necessarily saying that they adapted, right? They didn't mention that they grew these out specifically. And it's also not really complicating what came before. The Himalayan study is saying that if for these birds that are higher up, they have more warmth. For the birds that are lower, they have less insulation. That's all it is. That still matches up with that prediction about feather structures varying depending on the habitat, specifically the habitat temperature. So that is missing as well, right? They're not really talking about, um, I'm sorry, where was it? There we go. They're not saying they adapted. They're not complicating the earlier hypothesis. So C is out. Okay. D, the results of Barf's study suggest the ability of birds to withstand cold temperatures is determined more strongly by feather length than feather structure, challenging an established belief. Okay, are they saying that in any part of this? Are they saying that um, the feather length is more important than the feather structure? They never made that comparison. All they said was the higher elevation have more of the downy section. They don't really have the flat and smooth sections, and those feathers are longer, but they never ever really mentioned um, that the length is more important or it's more strongly protecting them. So because of that, answer choice D is out. B has to be the right answer. And when the right answer isn't super clear to you, that's especially when you need to focus on what is wrong and take out the trash. All right, so that is an example of main idea. Let's go ahead on to another one, which let me actually show you a different one. Let's go over poetry because I know some students tend to get a little bit nervous about that. Please, please, please don't stress over it. Even if it's like an older poem like this one, we're going to just focus on the key words in the text, and we're going to make sure that we're taking things one bite at a time. So working the question first, it says, which quotation from Loon Points most effectively illustrates the claim? Okay, well, first of all, we need to make sure we know our claim. So when I work the passage, I'm gonna make sure I really zoom in to the claim, which tends to come up right at the end. So this says, Loon Point is a 1912 poem by Amy Lowell. In the poem, which presents a nighttime scene on a body of water, Lowell describes an element of nature as an active participant in the experience. Okay, that is our claim. The claim is always right before the underlined part. So quick tip, claim is usually right before the underlined portion. All right, speak for ourselves. I'm just going to focus on what was mentioned. They're saying that nature is active and participating. Actually, why am I over complicating it? I'm just going to repeat that. Active participant. Okay, active participant. It has to be tied to that. So now let's take a look at our options. Mm, Okay, if it's not mentioning anything being actively participating, then we are going to get rid of it. All right, starting with, let's work our way from bottom up. But the moon in her wayward beauty is ever and always the same. Well, it does mention nature, yes. I'm not really seeing anything active. Like the moon isn't taking action. She's just there and beautiful. Okay. So not exactly what we're looking for because this is not really talking about action. So D is out. Okay. Or like the snow white petals which drop from an overblown rose. Okay, there's some action going on there. So maybe we'll take a look and come back to C. Okay, now B says, softly the water ripples against the canoe's curving side. Well, a ripple is just kind of happening. It's not really an action. So even if we're like, I don't know, Olga, that's still kind of an action. Okay. But if it's an active participant, it's going to be in your face active. A says, through the water, the moon writes her legends in light on the smooth, wet sand. Notice the difference there. Look at that language, right? How much stronger this is. They're saying rights versus water ripples. Actually, let me get this one. Ripples is kind of passive, it just happens. To drop, dropping is super passive. So because these two are more passive, we're going to want to go with answer choice A. That's more active. To write something, that's a very active move. Okay. Now, in terms of command of evidence, I'm just going to give you a few tips as we get closer to the end of our questions here. Let's see, actually. Okay. For this one, looking at the question first, it's asking which of these statements, if true, like they're always going to be true, would most directly support the student's claim. And typically that claim is the last sentence. If they don't say the word claim, they may say something like asserts, like how we have here. So the other thing I want you to keep in mind here Adverbs are very important. Adverbs are those words that end in ly to describe an action. Directly, always pay close attention to that. The other thing you can do, especially on the SAT, only read what you really need to. Like, let's say we read that last sentence and we can get to the right answer. That's it. We're done. We're not going to read any more. We are doing the least because if we do the most, if we do more than we have to, we're not going to last that much because it's a test of endurance. You're sitting there for SAT about 2-ish hours, ACT about 3. You don't really sit for that long for a test often. So if you're giving your all and doing all of these unnecessary steps, you're going to get more tired, which means you're more likely to make silly mistakes. We don't want to do that. Okay, so I'm going to just read that last sentence and let's see if we can get to the right answer. This says the student asserts that the explanatory notes were included in the republication primarily as a marketing device to help sell the standalone volume. So, actively working that passage, here's what they're asserting. They're saying the explanatory notes, okay, they put them in there mainly as a marketing device because they wanted to sell something. So in the speak for yourself, we're going to ignore those answer choices if you're looking at them, fight the temptation. We're going to speak for ourselves because we're not letting College Board win. Okay, I'm going to say, so these notes added mainly to help sell. And I'm just going to put some dollar signs here. Okay, it has to be related to trying to sell stuff. All right, let's go ahead and get to the correct answer together. Take a look, take your time. Let me know what feels like it doesn't match the speak for ourselves. Think about what is irrelevant to selling more. Yes, nicely done. A is irrelevant. It has nothing to do with things being identical, right? A says the text of the poem as published in the quarterly journal is not identical to the text of the poem published in the standalone volume. Okay, what does that have to do with money? Nothing. All right, what else is irrelevant? B. Yes, nice. B is out of here because it's saying many critics believe that the poet's explanatory notes remove certain ambiguities of the poem. Even if you don't know what ambiguities are, you don't need to, because look at this part. Make it less interesting. If something's less interesting, people are not going to buy it, usually. All right, let's see. What else is trash? What is not the right answer? Yes, hey, let's go. You got it. D is out of here because it has nothing to do with drafts, right? The drafts don't tell us anything about them trying to make more money, but answer choice C talks about making the book attractive to readers who already had a copy, right? If I already have a copy of something, you definitely need to make something tempting in order for me to want to buy another copy of that same thing. So answer choice C is the only one that is related to marketing. Okay, just make sure that I'm not missing any questions in the chat. All right. So we're going to wrap up in a little bit. Thank you all, by the way, for taking the time to join me today. This is the effort that it takes in order to make progress on either SAT or ACT. So again, thank you so much for being here. And hopefully you're seeing that even though the passages may be boring, they may be a little bit confusing, the questions and answers may not always be clear. If we apply strategy and if we think simply, the answer is there for you in a more obvious way, with less effort, with less pain. And again, if I can take some of that headache away from you, then I've done my job well. Okay, we'll come back to inferences maybe. When they ask about most logically completes the text, by the way, these tend to come up last in the reading. Let me make sure I write that over here. These tend to take more time and effort. But what I found is that the correct answer tends to be most directly tied to the last few lines. So that's kind of the trend here with the reading in general. The last few sentences tend to, I don't want to say matter the most, they tend to be most directly tied to the correct answer. All right, charts and graphs. Let's take a look at this one. So for charts and graphs, you want to make sure you're zooming in to the question first. So this mentions, or this asks you to use data from the graph, but we also have to support Martinez and the colleague's conclusion. So let's take a look at this graph and then we'll find the conclusion, which tends to be the last sentence. So looking at the key is really important. We have different types of, looks like we have grass cover, bare, forest cover, then we have years on the X, and then we have area on the Y. Okay, and this is about characteristics of the banks of the Provo River downstream of the Jordanelle Dam. Okay, so we're looking at different types of cover throughout the years. All right, so now I'm noticing the word concluded in the very last sentence. That's all I'm going to zoom in on. That's it. They concluded that the dam changed the flow of the river in ways that benefited grass plants. Oh, here we go, right? This is what I'm saying. There's always a pattern here. The more you practice, the more you'll see it. But didn't benefit trees. So we need to prove two things. One is that it benefited grass, benefit grass. So we should see grass cover being taller, but it needs to also not benefit trees. Notice we're getting away for the most part, especially the previous question and this one, without reading everything. You don't need to. Only read what you absolutely need to. Okay, so let's kind of speak for ourselves in terms of where we need to be for these years. Looking at the graph especially. Okay, let's see, where do we see grass cover being the tallest? See? Okay, let me just check one quick thing. Let's see if we got any other submissions. You got it. It is D. Nice. So grass cover increased from 1987 to 1993 and from 1993 to 2006. So just to show you that, right? Here is our grass cover. It's increasing. So the data is right, but we want to make sure that it doesn't benefit trees. So it says forest cover decreased in those periods, and we can prove that. Forest cover is the darker bar right over here, and here it's going down, right? So usually the trap answers here tend to revolve around incorrect data. So let me actually write that out. So traps, they're going to have incorrect data or correct data that does not support the conclusion, which is why it's so important that you work the question. Always keep the question in mind. All right, so a few other quick things that I'll mention, and then we'll do some questions and answers at the end. When they ask you about characters, you're really focusing in on behavior, motivation, personality, relationships. It's kind of similar to what you would look at in your English class. And if this is ACT, it's going to be the first passage, but you do it last. And then typically it's going to be about two questions per test. So whether SAT or ACT, this doesn't come up a whole lot. So this is what it would look like. It would say what is true about Eleanor. Again, you would use our strategy and take out the trash, especially on these, because these are so easy to overthink. Here's another example of this one. They're asking something specific, right? They're asking about this specific scenario. So you'd have to make sure you definitely have your concrete textual evidence, scan the text, make sure that you speak for yourselves, especially here. Now, for paired questions, here's what you're going to do in terms of, let me actually show you really quick. When we have dual passages here, you want to make sure that you're reading the question first, and then you're going to read each paragraph and then speak for yourself as well. But unlike the SAT, on the ACT, you're not reading them back to back. Please don't do that on the ACT. On the ACT, you read one passage, answer the questions only for that passage. Then you read another passage, answer only the questions for that passage. Then you're ready to answer the questions for both. There's about 3 of these that ask about both. Now, honestly, in my opinion, and in general, those three questions tend to take the most time and effort. I typically don't recommend that students even attempt them unless you're aiming for a 34 or higher on the ACT. You typically don't need those points, right? Because you can miss a certain amount of questions and still hit a 34 in the reading for the ACT. So what we recommend is to use letter of the day. You're going to use this for any questions that are not worth your time or any questions that you run out of. Like let's say you pick C, you would use C on every guess. Like, let's say there's three questions you don't get to answer, like these, right? You would pick C, 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 back to back. Do not do A, B, C, or switch it up because statistically, you're less likely to get something right. Stick with one letter and one letter only. Do not leave anything blank, please. Even for the math griddens, you never know. You never know. Okay, so this is what it looks like. You also want to start with the passage that has more questions. So if we look at if we look at passage A, this one has 4 questions, whereas this one has 3 questions. We always want to start with the passage that's more worth our time. So this would be first. Okay, so here's just an example of what that would look like, and you still don't have to go in the order that they give them to you. Do the lighter lift first. Okay, so just an example of what these look like. And all of the trap answers come from the other passage typically. So let's say you only read passage A, you never read passage B. It's so much easier to take out the traps. Otherwise, you're more likely to mix up the two passages, which is exactly what they want. Okay, so just a few other tips. You always want to look for context, treat it as an open book test, read literally, try to zoom in and predict things. Like, let's say you're stuck between a few answer choices. Like, you're thinking, oh, maybe it is provide statistics. Okay, well, then I better see some statistics here. And if I don't see any numbers, there's no way that I can pick C. Really zoom in, have almost like tunnel vision with it, and treat it super literally. And just to recap, you're not going to pick anything with extreme language, something that's super negative, unless it's the dual passage and there's support for that. We're avoiding opinions. We're avoiding anything too general or too specific. And the other thing is, we're avoiding when they take words from the text and then change the meaning of it, right? Like that text that gets misinterpreted. So these are just some examples of that. I know I went through a lot of information with you all today. Thank you so much for your time, for your effort. In terms of what we do here at Enhanced Prep, things like this mean a lot to us because we are honestly passionate educators who just want to help students out. So whether you work with us or not, we do these free workshops to make sure that you at least have some tools, some strategies, and we will send out the recording as well as the annotated notes. So don't worry, you can even practice these questions on your own if you'd like, whatever we did not get to. And we have experts here. We have people with masters and PhDs and a decade of experience. Well, I'm almost at a decade soon. And we just want to make sure that we help you and make the college admissions process as easy as possible because let's be real, high school's already stressful. You don't need the SAT and the ACT also stressing you out. Now, a few quick takeaways before we end for today. Something really important to consider, your GPA is really important. So make sure you're solidifying your transcript. Do not sacrifice studying for school in order to study for the SAT. School has to come first, but your SAT, ACT, they do make up 20 to 35% of the admissions decision and 50% of your merit-based scholarship decision. So please, please study, practice, and kick some College Board or ACT butt, right? These tests are a pain, but we can either let them defeat us, we can give up, or we can use them to our benefit. So just some other things for you to keep in mind if you're curious about what is right for you, or maybe you're curious about any group courses one-on-one, you can actually reach out to advisor@enhancedprep.com. We do offer free 30-minute consultations to help you figure out, even if you're like, I don't even know what test to go with. Right. And we provide one-on-one, we have group, we have more free events. So please feel free to register for more. We got you covered. We got your back. Whether it's also reviewing your PSAT score, we got your back. Alrighty, thank you all for joining. We really, really appreciate your time. Please reach out to advisor at enhancedprep.com if you have any questions or if there's anything at all that we can do to assist.